Hello everyone and welcome to Connect with Evie. My name is Evelyn and I am your source for tips and tricks about every secret nook and cranny in Objectif Lune's flagship product. This video marks the start of Season 2 of Connect with Evie, where we start exploring new subjects. Now, I apologize for the long, unexpected, and kind of unannounced break. There's many different reasons why that happened, which I don't really want to get into, but suffice it to say that I am back and I will be providing videos as regularly as possible. Now, today's video is about process management in workflow. Now, this doesn't actually have anything to do with Connect specifically. It's all about our automation tool. But since Connect does use the automation tool when you have Prez or Planet Press Connect, that means that you do need to kind of understand how things work. So let's take a look at a workflow along with a couple of different things that we can do that will help you along managing various processes in time and in functionality. So here I have a few processes that they're all disabled for the very reason that I don't want it to actually capture anything. These I just want to show you all of the properties. The first thing that I want to show you is the time grid. The time grid defines when a process runs on a schedule. So by default, so this is the default process properties. I haven't changed anything in here, where a process will essentially run its input every 4 seconds by default at any time of the day. It never stops. So here we have the as soon as possible, and it says polling interval every 4 seconds, which means every 4-second workflow looks in the input, sees if there's new data files, and if there is, it runs it. Another example is a process that runs every hour or once every hour. Now, in order to enable or activate that time grid, you need to remove the as soon as possible. Because as soon as possible means files come in, process them. Files come in, process them. It doesn't care about the grid when you have that. So unchecking this means that you do have access. Now, what you can do is, this starts off as completely clear, and you can select specific times in the grid where this happens. So basically, you can say, oh, well, I want this process to run every Sunday, every hour on Sunday, or I want it to run on Sundays and Wednesdays for whatever reason. Like, essentially, you have the control over. Now, you can actually specify that time division. The minimum is 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes you run. And then you can say every 24 hours, which is, essentially once a day. The poll once per activity period option is a fairly important one, and I need to basically go into details about that. So the way that polling works is that your initial input task, so the folder capture, the folder listing, FTP input, whatever, HTTP server input, will run once, go through the process, and then go back to that initial input task and see if there's any new data file. And if there is, we'll run again. And that is considered one execution of the process, running until there are no more files to capture. So if I have folder capture and I have 100 files, then it'll run 100 times, even if I have this poll once per activity period. If any new file comes in to that folder during the time that the first 100 are processed, at the end of the 100, it'll go back and it'll see another file, it'll continue processing. So even if you have that poll once per activity period, you can have something that'll run for hours. This is, let's say, useful if we get to the end of the month run, and I'll show you in a moment, but I just wanted to explain that it is possible that this will run eternally. Now, if we go back here, the polling interval is actually kind of important in that it's ignored if poll once per activity period is checked. If you uncheck it, then it runs or it starts a new polling every 4 seconds. meaning in between it'll wait. Okay, so we saw the every hour one, which is basically all months, all weeks, divide by 1, and then just select all. So every single hour of every day is checked. That runs once an hour. You can have that once a day, where it runs at midnight. And one other alternative to that, if you want to run at a specific time that is not midnight, you could say, well, okay, I'm going to say every half hour, and I'm going to say every day at 30 past midnight. That's when it's going to run. And again, poll once per activity period to do an invoice run or whatever. So it'll run that at 30 past midnight every day. Those are the two things that you can do. And the last one is end of the month. And the end of the month is actually a little modified. I'm saying all months, and then I am dividing by date so that I actually have every day of the month in the end. But of course, you say, well, okay, there's 28, 29, 30, or 31 days in a month. Well, we have the last option. And what I suggest that you can do, something like this, is at the last day of the month, let's say at 8 or 7 or something, then you can say, hey, I want you to run my whole monthly invoice thing starting at 7. And during this time, if you have, for example, a process in your system that starts at 5 or that starts at 7, and it starts generating single files, then starting your process at 7 means even if your initial system isn't done, isn't finished, then it's going to continue capturing files until it is finished. All right, so that is it for the time grid. Obviously, there's more options, and if you hit F1 from that keyboard, you'll see the documentation for the process time grid, which gives a little more details on how it works. But those are the initial ideas. So the next thing I want to show you is the send to process concept. Now, send to process essentially is when I'm done doing something, so when I finished one process, I want you to take the job file and send it to another process. So process 1, this guy, is going to do something, and when it's finished, it passes the file to this other process 2, which is going to receive it, do something, and then exit. Now, there are many things that you can do with this concept. So you can have one process that splits a file and then sends each split to another process that, does things automatically or does things really quickly. In order to test this process, because of the way that workflow works, I have this as a startup process, which I also want to show you what this is. So the startup process means that this will run when workflow service starts. And you can only have a single startup process. When you enable the startup process, everything else disables because there's no concept of time grid or polling because it only runs when the service starts. So if I send this process to my workflow and it starts, this is actually going to run. Now, there's an important technical detail about using send process, which I want to talk to you about, which is that not everything in your process is available. One important thing is that you don't have access to metadata in the second process. What you do have access to is local variables if they're in both. So you can see I have a test variable that's local on both. You have the job file, and you have the job infos. So job info 0 to 9, and then the local variables. So what I have here is a create file that just takes the job file itself, and then that %9 variable and the test variable I created, and then it sends that to a folder. And if I open this, you can see that I have my initial file and the 2 variables that are indeed correctly defined. So here's one very important thing. When this runs and it sends to my second process here, the initial input task is ignored, meaning it doesn't use the folder capture. It simply takes the job file that's being sent by the first process and then runs that inside of it. And this happens even if the process is disabled. So if you disable the process completely, you remove the active option, it won't run unless it has a job being sent by another process. By the way, before I forget, in the process logic category, this white losange, this is actually where you will find the different tasks that I'm using here. So the send to process and the go sub are located right here. So the sub process is a little similar to the send to process. The difference is when the sub process is finished, it'll return to the main process and then do whatever other tasks there are in there. So here I have my main process where, again, I create an initial value, I set some job infos, and then I do some metadata things because I want to show you something. And then I go sub, which goes into the sub process, does blah, blah, and then returns. So let me go through this, and why did I create metadata? So the metadata thing is because I want to show you that, contrarily to the send to process, it is very possible to use metadata in a sub-process. It is 100% functional. And the reason for that is, if you can imagine, when you run a sub-process, what workflow does is take the sub-process, pops it into that workflow process. Like basically takes all the tasks and put them in, and this is what actually runs. It's not something super like secret in the background. It's not super complicated. It just takes all the tasks and it shoves it into the main process, and that's how it saves it in the service. So this is why when I do create metadata and I add a field here, which is right there, and I go into my sub process and I'm setting %7 to the value of the metadata, then this %7 is available. So the metadata is right there, it is accessible, it is active, and I can use it in data selections. Now let me show you by debugging this. So if I step through, creates metadata, creates a field, and if I look at metadata, it's right here. I think I put it in job right here. So I have my value in the metadata. And if I look at debug, I also see that %8, %9 are there. So everything is good. And test virus has, so my local variable has a value here. And then when I step into my sub process, then I can see that everything has followed. So my metadata selection right here did function, did work. When I create file, that file has everything in my initial thing. And then when it finishes that sub process, it goes back to the main file. If I had another task here, a branch condition, whatever, everything here would be functional. So you might be wondering, why do we have two? So if sub-process exists, why do we have send to process? Well, it's simple. Sub-process can be used in many different processes, but the process that calls it will wait, hold, until the sub-process is finished, wait for the return, and then continue. So if you're waiting for something to happen, waiting on a confirmation, on a variable, on a check, or whatever, then sub-process is the way to go. If you don't care, if all you need to do is to send the file and say, okay, I'm done, I don't need anything else, then send to process is the way to go. So as I mentioned before, you can split and send to different processes. Now, two last things that I want to touch upon. Let me just create a new process that is a self-replicating process. The self-replicating process is a little too complicated to go in depth in this video. However, the self-replicating process is one that will run in parallel, meaning there can be many instances of this process running at the same time. All you need to do is to check this option, and then you can change one preference here, which is this. So the maximum number of total self-replicating processes inside of the whole workflow. And then what happens is the folder capture, for example, if I have 10 self-replicated processes and I have 100 files, then all 10 will take one file, run it, finish, grab another, and continue. So it'll run theoretically 10 times as faster, depending on what processing you're doing. There are some limitations and some complexities involved because it's computers, so nothing is in absolutes. One very big reason why the self-replicating process is important is the use of the HTTP server input. So if you have any sort of web input, you should really put it as a self-replicating process. The reason for that is that a web client that's making a request probably has a timeout. You want to respond as quickly as possible, so you want to have multiple parallel processing answering requests at the same time. And also, if you're doing one main process and you're splitting and sending files to a folder and you want it to process those small jobs as fast as possible, then the self-replicating process is super useful at the same time. So basically, these are very good for very small, very quick tasks that have to run as fast as possible. So this concludes today's Connect with Evie. I hope you learned something new today. If you have any questions, comments, something you want to hear about in the shows, please don't hesitate to comment below. Like the video if you like it, subscribe if you want to be advised of any new videos that come out. And as always, see you in a few clicks.